Without further ado, Anna, you can give it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before starting, I would like to sincerely thank the organizers for holding this event and gathering us to discuss such a crucial topic. I am pleased to be among people willing to explore how we can further climate justice, and I applaud every panelist for these insightful speeches so far. It is a pleasure to hear you. I am grateful for the opportunity to present my draft paper. It is an honor to speak, and I hope to feed the reflection with this modest contribution. I will be speaking on a topic which came to my attention when I started my doctoral research last year. So I focus on a legal inquiry on human cultural expressions in the context of the climate crisis. Sorry. Today, I will more generally discuss how to repair the irreparable in the face of climate change, that is to say, addressing non-economic loss and damage in climate reparations. Due to time constraints, I will keep my presentation short and I won't be able to cover the entire case law available, so I apologize for this. I stay ready to elaborate if needed. As an introduction, it is necessary to establish NELD, non-economic loss and damage, as a delicate issue in climate reparations. It is globally defined as what is not easily quantifiable in financial terms or exchanged on markets, such as damage to cultural heritage, ecological impairment, or loss of human life. NELD are marginalized in climate negotiations and remain inadequately addressed by expert discussions in the climate regime framework. So it is still at the margin of negotiation between states, and it's mostly tackled through workshops, experts, roundtables, etc. Thankfully, climate justice can be sought outside of the climate regime, and the potential forms of remedy are broad enough to include NELD. Besides, climate damage are too complex to be separated into categories, and different means, structural or monetary, can cover the same harm. Thus, I will present how NELDs could be repaired through a maximalist and holistic approach to reparations. We will first consider the perspective of pecuniary and non-pecuniary reparations that could be awarded by jurisdictional bodies. We will then underline the relevance of negotiations and the necessity of more general normative developments to fully respond to NELDs. So firstly, let's consider how courts can rule in favor of compensation for NELDs. Contemporary international law recognizes moral harm. More than 1 century ago, arbitral commissions in the Topaz, Lusitania, Faulkner, and McNeil cases concerning ships ruled in favor of compensation for human death, arbitrary detention. This was reaffirmed later in the human rights field. See, for instance, the Inter-American Court in the Velázquez-Rodriguez versus Honduras case. Compensation of ecological harm was also recognized among many cases by the United Nations Claims Commission in the past, and the ICJ more recently in its certain activities case. International courts are lenient concerning the valuation of such harm and use different notions to justify their monetary assessment of moral harm. On the basis of equity, the African court, for instance, awarded 100 million Kenyan shillings in the Ojek case, and the ICJ, in its harmed activity in the territory of the Congo order, ruled in favor of a global sum for all environmental damage incurred. Some bold changes in practice, notably before the European Court of Human Rights, might suggest an evolution in terms of punitive damages, an adequate prospect for framing monetary reparations as sanctions for emitters. According to jurisprudence, to case law, Compensation can also be repayment for sums necessary to repair harm. Case in point, the ICJ order in the case opposing Costa Rica to Nicaragua. This leads us to question if NELs are truly and exclusively non-economical at their core, and suggest not to abandon the perspective of pursuing compensation through litigation. However, compensation faces many shortcomings. It can be used to buy out the continuation of harmful activities. Assessing moral harm is a particularly subjective task with uncertain outcomes, and the mere idea of putting a price on moral values has raised a lot of criticism in the past and in current work in literature. Thus, compensation should not be the sole means of repairing nails. That is why the hypothesis of litigating for non-pecuniary redress of nails should be explored. Collective reparations are more adequate to repair climate harm in general. First, international case law relies heavily on declaratory judgments, which imply further redress measures in the future. Quoting Dinah Shelton, "It is the beginning of remedies, not the end." We have an example with the reparation asked for by a human rights body, for instance, like in the Daniel Bailey recent communication by the Human Rights Committee. Even if satisfaction measures are secondary forms of reparations, they can play a significant role in addressing nails through their general scope. Example can be found in the Inter-American Court's ruling. In the La Oroya case, for instance, Peru was ordered to organize a public gathering and acknowledge its wrong. The African courts, in the Ojek case, asked for public apologies and the building of monuments. We can imagine similar symbolic initiative for climate nails. Besides, guarantees of cessation and non-repetition would be the cornerstone of redress for nails, as they would bring structural change. In the La Oroya ruling, the court asked for restoration plans and the improvement of environmental standards. The Ojek case led to a call for consultation of affected communities in decision processes, a measure also favored in the Torres Island case on climate consequences, and in a recent decision from the Committee on the Right of the Child concerning harmful activities in Sami territory in Finland. These perspectives are all the more so adequate as they arise, according to the RCOA, in case of a successful actio populari case brought forward by non-affected states. These are realistic outcomes to address large-scale climate moral harm. However, a maximalist approach to climate reparation leads to consider cooperation and assistance as well. Climate litigation brings its share of shortcomings such as jurisdiction, standing, causation, procedural costs, enforcement of rulings as well. Reparation of nails should be dealt outside of court through international negotiation, with litigation providing an impetus to negotiate. Sorry if you heard my mail. First, states have historically favored settling their dispute by ex gratia, discretionary payments, and negotiations. The ICJ itself leaves it to states to attend first to settle reparations. Finance could also be a placeholder for pecuniary reparations. This appears to be the most favored pathway, actually, in the climate change regime, as suggests the mandates attributed to the Global Environment Facility, Bank, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Shield Against Climate Risk, and the recently created L&D Fund. The latter could become an appropriate forum to consider NELD, since it is the only financial mechanism with a clear mandate to address the matter. One key condition would be to discard any mention of liability which could impair cooperation with, for instance, because of the reluctance of developed states, big emitters, to address issues of responsibility. So the key would be to focus on voluntary payments, which would indirectly serve as compensation without facing its hurdle and the hurdles of calculation of damages, and proving as well attribution and responsibility. Besides, without referring to reparation, any grants for mitigation and adaptation projects would contribute in the end to address NELD by reducing further and future damages. In general, international finance should be directly granted to locally led projects, focusing, for instance, on restoration of local ecosystems. Without being framed as reparation, such actions, such projects, would pursue the same outcomes, resilience and justice. Finally, transitional justice processes could be instituted in the climate change governance framework as a way to address loss and damage. Some authors have proposed to set up truth and reconciliation commissions, for instance, to ascertain facts, to evaluate current and future harm. There were also talks to consider amnesty, limitation of liability, and to pursue structural reforms. To sum up, it can be said that these potential actions aim at future-oriented and participative reparations. They are not unrealistic, as emitters today favor dialogue over responsibility, compensation, liability. Finally, Justice for NELS calls for a fairer international order. Despite attempts to negotiate and provide finance, reparation of NELS is stalling and depends on the political will of states. Only broader reforms de lege ferenda in international law will permit to cross this gap. We need to consider future-oriented justice and responsibility in the international order. Several prospects can be brought up in terms of responsibility, such as strict liability for private operators, or the perspective of shared responsibility among states. But given their specific nature, NELS call for a preventive approach. Ecological integrity, planetary boundaries, stewardship, and restoration, or Earth system law could be key components for a more adequate law to keep nature safe in the Anthropocene. We could also imagine, for instance, development concerning debts and like sovereign debts and the erasing of sovereign debt in order to conduct climate action and focus on environmental protection. Finally, we need structural reform in the international order. Prospective change could be instilling more solidarity among or non-human, present or future, in legal framework. It could be also affirming the planetary common interest and ensuring public participation. In conclusion, we should consider every pathway available to seek redress for NELD. Litigation and negotiation, payments and reforms go hand in hand. It is through their optimal use that we will realize climate justice for what we all dearest. Thank you for your attention.
Very much, Anna, for what I feel was very optimistic and exploring a lot of actionable avenues to circumvent difficulties we've been talking about since yesterday. So thank you so much. As promised, I'm looking at the audience and the co-panelists to see if there's immediate reactions or questions. I would seize the opportunity, but otherwise, yeah, well, I have questions, but we'll see if in the end we still have time for the discussion. I'm looking at the audience again. No questions, no pressing comments. Great. So thank you so much, Anna. Stay around. I know you've been following for and Yago, if you want to take the floor for the second part, you want to share your screens.
Well, so good afternoon, everyone. I would like first to thank for the organizing committee for this conference. It's a great opportunity of having scholars and research at different levels, different regions, and have been really enriching. And I'm really glad to be here and part of this. My name is Yago Freire. I'm currently a research assistant at the University of Glasgow, and I'm working on the intersection of international law, climate finance, and climate governance. So today I will explore a question that sits at the core of the institutional legitimacy in the post-Paris Agreement climate regime, if the World Bank can deliver climate justice. This question is not only technical, but also profoundly political and legal. And it requires to interrogate the material structures, the normative logics, for us to be able to reshape the institutions to deliver the climate justice. And also it becomes especially pressing now, this topic, in light of the lost and found that was officially established in COP28 and are temporarily being hosted by the World Bank. Mostly because this fund is just not another climate finance instrument as we had priorly, but it also represents decades of advocacy from global South countries that were asking not only for charity, but also for the recognition of responsibility for the developed countries. I would begin then with our main questions. Is this institution that have been historically shaped by donor interest and development orthodoxy, as they can act as a vehicle for climate justice. I will delve into some tensions that have been going on during this period of the transitioning for their next institution that will host the loss and damage found. And my research, it is basically to analyze all the tools and the documents that they have been issuing as the climate toolkit that World Bank have been proposing. Also, during the COP28, they were in the decision they had 11 conditions that would the World Bank would have to compromise to attend in order to be the one to host this lost and found. And I also will frame this with other perspectives and the past and the historical of the World Bank for us to see if there is something new coming from these new policies that they've been developing, or if the only way is to reshape and to reform their structure. So I will begin then with the bank's historical engagement with climate finance, because institutional memory shapes institutional possibilities. So the World Bank's involvement with climate finance have begun with the Global Environmental Facility in 1991. It was developed aligned with the UNFCCC, and its operations were run through the World Bank, even though they were not exactly inside of the World Bank institution. The World Bank was hosting and doing the management and procurement, fiduciary standard, and project approval procedures, as it still does this today. And the GF was built on a procedural cost model, which is they would only found marginal cost of greening transition, mostly focused on development projects. So it was very technical. It was the founding was project by project to countries. And the governance model also reflected the donor dominance once mostly of the GF in the late 90s and 2000s was driving for this development for countries who were developing infrastructure, and they would be able to repay the debts. And then in 2008, with the rising of frustration over the pace of the climate negotiations and the limitations of the GEF, the bank launched the Climate Investment Funds, this time outside of the UNFCCC, which also raised concerns about the Global South countries who were aiming that this would divide the efforts of the climate funds that should be under the UNFCCC. This fund is still existent today, and it's also managed entirely by the World Bank. After that, in 2010, under the COP16 in Cancun, we had the Green Climate Fund, which is the biggest one we have until today. It was only operationalized in 2015. and also raises some concerns that we will analyze and debate a little bit further. We have, before this, if Reparations, a shift from compartmentalized climate investment in GEF and CEF, and then after Paris Agreement, we had the Green Climate Fund that was more independent. They had some perspectives of funding exactly direct for projects instead of just nations, and at some moments they don't need to pass through all the World Bank. Some other banks, some other institutions can have access directly for the from the GCF. And then we got into the COP28 with the Loss and Damage Fund. It took so many meetings for them to take the decision. What we have interesting here is that the Loss and Damage Fund. I'm so sorry for Loss and Damage Fund. Loss Fund. They had a mosaic perspective, which is they recognize that responsibility is not only for the founding countries, but for other organizations, international organizations, and also from the private sectors. And also they have a new governance ambition related to it. They want to do it large scale projects in large scale. They have to be inclusive, they have to be anticipatory. And this is within the scope of the decisions of the COP28. And it was taken a lot of debate about who would, like the institution that would host the fund. And the developing countries didn't want the World Bank because of the past structures. But then they developed 11 conditionalities for the World Bank to compromise. And for now, we are in a 4-year trial period where the World Bank is developing new policies and kind of trying to convince the rest of the world that would be the perfect for hosting this funding. So in one sense, we have a tension here between climate finance logic and the World Bank logic. From one side, we have the logic of climate justice. There is needs-based, participatory, and concessional, and it recognizes, differentiates vulnerability, values inclusive governance, and is rooted in reparative ethics. And on the other side, we have the logic of the World Bank that have been demonstrated throughout years, based on the principles of creditworthiness, risk minimization, and state centrality. So access to fund is conditional. The eligibility is often tied to prior lending relationships between countries and parties and the World Bank. And financial instruments are heavily skewed towards loans, even in the context of climate-induced catastrophes. So the World Bank had released then the climate tool in 2023 with a new mission of ending poverty in a livable world, where they stated that most of their funders would have climate change and ending poverty as the center. And so exactly what are the new tools that have developed for us? These are the main ones. First of them, this is a climate resilient debt clauses, which already existed in some of the laws they had it, but it's basically a pause if a country is suffering from some climate catastrophe, so they can stop repaying without any further consequences on that. And they extend this for every single law that World Bank is doing it under or outside the Loss and Damage Fund. The relocation of financing, which means that if in that moment they are in the process of financing another project and there is a catastrophe, they could reallocate for a country or the amount of money to address this specific catastrophe or crisis there is going on. Also, this wasn't a possibility before that. Linking preparedness and finance, which is something that already happened before. In a way, they are privileging the countries or the parties who already have some institutional stability, or they are prepared to ask for the loans from World Bank. So they inserted this as in a way to same for the other parties. So we will privilege those ones who are already prepared, but it's also reinforce some structures that already had going on, right? Because the small islands or very poor states, they don't have the institutional capacity to ask for the loans. So in a way, they are also reinforce some power structures in the sense, and also private sector backstopping. They are redistributing and asking more private sectors for this funding as well. So these are the main in a bigger, large scale as they want to increase the scale of the participation. So these are the main propositions of the Climate 2, the Climate 2 kit proposed by them. And I analyzed some of these toolkits with the prior documents that they had already. The only exactly new tool that they developed is the climate resilient debt clauses that would not be able to actually develop to face a climate crisis. The other ones, they were already mentioned priorly, and the GCF mostly, but they were also mentioned in prior documents and guidelines for the World Bank to work on. And the thing is, World Bank have been then also trying to develop new frameworks for independence of the loss and damage fund, to give them a more independent. But GCF also have an independent body, but as the World Bank is hosting them, it's also in a way impossible for us to achieve exactly what climate justice and the developing countries were aiming for, which is the responsibility and the possibility to influence and in the finance systems that will be developed by the bank. So I have two central proposals in the sense, which is amended the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development and the IDA, which are the agreements based on for the World Bank, most biggest institutions, to permit governance and operational autonomy for hosted climate funds. For the instance, I know that the scholars have been engaging with this topic for a while, and the main question remains, which is, only with a policy within and inside of the World Bank could we develop this, and the answer is no. Even with the GCF having equality in the board directors, the managers still has most of the developed countries taking the decisions, and you cannot legally separate the risks and the responsibility of the World Bank outside of the founding. So who are hosting the founding would always think in the risks they are occurring, because you cannot exactly develop a total legal body outside of the World Bank. And even GCF, for instance, they can do they can donate straight to the countries. They don't do it. And the last data that they released in 2024, they had donated or loaned around 14 billions of dollars, and around 26% of that was just for the World Bank, even though the World Bank should not be the one exactly the main one, right? And the other one was the UN, also with a percentage of more than 20%, and the rest was countries, which again doesn't allow the local communities or small projects to develop their projects also. So one of the proposals then was to reframe the World Bank institutions in a way that, for instance, the GCF is already working it. It would be more equitable. It is not the goal in a way, but it's more equitable than having just donor countries taking the decisions and also bearing all the risks of the decisions. And GCF, for instance, they have a quality of numbers from developing country and developed country to taking the decisions. This framework would be replicated also in the loss and damage found is that what have been developing, what have they been issuing, but the historical process shows to us that this is more political than legal. If you don't reframe the legal institutions in a way that the political actors, the people who are involved, they would have to act in a certain way, there is no possibility that the political demand of donors, drive-ins, and developing countries would be altered. And also institutionalized direct access to loss and damage. For this to happen, you don't actually need to reform the agreements that base the World Bank as GCF, for instance. But again, you don't have any security, legal security, that this does not be a wrapped and policy as GCF, for instance. But the institutions would be obliged to follow up this process and to institutionalize this kind of donation. So just to end, I just put some, I should have been put at this slide before, but so with some of these propositions of reframing, we have the toolkit gives a technocratic, not a transformative working. They also, the articles of the agreements restricts access and centralized authority, and it was keep going on if we don't reframe it. There is a governance exclusion, so this will remain, the communities will not have access, just the countries sometimes don't repass these fountains for the communities, for the local communities. And there is a depth-based logic persists, because even though you have right now there's other clauses that you can pause. If you pause it, but the law is still there, but also but the country with dealing with a catastrophe, so the debt is still going on. And also the toolkits, they doesn't have a reparative obligation, so we're still based on a loan perspective, debt perspective, mostly for the countries who are under less developed countries. There is under the IDA some specific measures for very less developed countries, but most of the countries who doesn't have any catastrophe going on other than small islands, they will still based on the same system that World Bank have been developed in. This is my conclusions. I'm still going on with my research. I didn't insert all of the data, all of the documents that I've been reading through, but I would love to have your considerations as well, and thank you.
Keep your answer for your questions for the end of the panel, and we're going to move to Francesca's presentation.
Okay, so another contribution on the topic of monetary compensation for climate change. With this paper, I actually take again so we go back to the topic of reparation for climate liability. And the title is a bit, so climate change, l'addition s'il vous plaît. We try to explain why this title. It's a comparative law and economic perspective on the calculation of damages. Just maybe because the two things to say about this topic. The first is about this. This is about I will first show my motivation, the research question, the methodology. I will talk about the impacts of climate change, the cost of climate change, the internalization of the cost, empirical analysis and conclusions. I try to be as short as possible.
That sounds like a trick.
Just two things to start. We can move forward. So these are just citations, quotations. So when we talk about climate change, we always have references to monetary compensation. So there are, we always talk about money. Now, as I was saying, we go back to the topic of climate change lawsuits. And many of these cases normally include claims for damage compensation. So, but the elephant in the room, we are talking about reparation, full reparation, and is it possible to go to court? What are the legal paths to go to court? What is the procedure? Who can go to court? But the topic of this paper is actually how much, what's the quantum of the damage compensation, and how much should we pay for climate change is actually an issue that is normally not covered so much by legal scholars, but also law and economic scholars. This is actually problematic because the magnitude of liability, and I use these technical terms which come from the law and economic scholarship. So the amount of liability is actually linked with optimal incentives of care on individuals. Here I need to include a short explanation from the theory of law and economics. We don't see the title, unfortunately. So the title is that from a law and economics perspective, we don't look at the liability in terms of victim compensation, victim reparation, but we look at liability in terms of deterrence. So how much should polluters pay in order to receive optimal incentives to invest in order to avoid the damage? So very basically, if I know that I have to pay 100, I will, it's not just 100, but I multiply the 100 times the probability of incurring in that liability. And then I have a calculation of how much I'm going to invest in advance to avoid the occurrence of the damage. So this is the law and economics perspective on liability. So looking more at the economic goal, which is minimizing the social costs of accidents, and in this case, the cost of climate change. Now, there is a big problem when it comes to in general, liability from a law and economic perspective. How can we balance the amount of liability with the real magnitude of harm? So this is already a big issue in the scholarship in general. It's not about climate change. What I made in this paper is to try to ask this question, how can we actually find this equation, but in the domain of climate change? So if the damage we are talking about is actually the impacts of climate change on the environment or on people. Now, the title is covered. So the question is, how much accuracy should be achieved? So do we need to achieve do we need to aim for a perfect equation? This is the amount of harm. This is the amount of compensation. Always from an economic perspective, what the scholar says that we don't want a perfect equation, but approximate. So we need to avoid big errors. So we need to avoid that big parts of the harm are not covered by the final compensation. So it's what the scholar says that we need just to avoid gross and systematic deviations from what should be the total amount of compensation. And I don't want to go too much in detail in the theory because it's too much for now. So the question is, do polluters pay for the full cost of climate change in climate liability cases? And I know, because I was also working on this from the international legal perspective, we also talk about full reparation in international law. So this is not a question which is relevant only from an economic perspective, but if we are talking about full reparation, full compensation at the international level, this is the same. So the methodology is a bit multidisciplinary. I started by looking into climate science. What are the impacts of climate change in general? Then I went into climate economics. How do economists calculate or quantify the impacts of climate change? So moving from impacts into cost of climate change. Then I went into an empirical legal analysis. So I took the case law cases and I tried to see how courts are quantifying the climate change damages. And the question is, are judges following what the economists are saying about climate change quantification? Yes or not? And I made a comparative what we call law and economics. So based on what I see as trends in different cases, we can deduce or we can infer conclusions from a law and economic perspective. Basically, is this trend going to bring up incentives to polluters to reduce the damage of their actions? So this is basically my approach. Now here, I think we can go very quickly. The impacts of climate change, we find them in reports. This is from the IPCC reports. The main point is that the impacts from a scientific perspective are normally split into impacts on ecosystems and impacts on human systems. So these are normally, this is the approach used by scientists. Based on this vision in science, so climate change to nature and humanity, the next step is, okay, now how can we move from impacts to costs of change? And I was reviewing the economics of climate change, so this whole area of climate change economics. And for the economists in general, we don't talk about impacts, we talk about costs, first of all. They talk about a negative aggregate effect on economic growth. And in economics, we split between economic and non-economic losses, which correspond to pecuniary, monetary, and non-monetary costs of climate change. Now, this is a kind of structure. I try to summarize what we find in the literature. So climate change can bring economic losses, which include loss of land, loss of infrastructures, agricultural losses, so the loss of production from a field, financial losses, losses from invasive alien species, losses from climate displacement, we talked about today. And on the other side, we have non-economic losses. So these are the losses which are not monetary quantifiable immediately. So human health, social and cultural damages, ecological damages. Then, and this is the the very interesting part, in economics of climate change, we have a separate box, the cost for adaptation and mitigation. These are not directly related to climate change, but these are costs that needs to be borne by people, by the society, in order to reduce all the other direct. So they have an impact on all the other direct costs. Okay, this is just the framework in economics. So there are many different approaches in economics. So in economics, they calculate the total cost of climate change. And this is the oldest theories are more about the total welfare effects of climate change. And it's also very challenging to calculate this. And then there is a new part, let's say a more recent approach in economics, which considering the challenge of calculating the total cost of climate change, they propose to use the social cost of carbon as a methodology to quantify the cost of climate change. The social cost of carbon is a bit complicated. It's about the marginal climate damage function. So it's the change in the value of economic welfare from the emission of an additional unit of CO2 in the atmosphere. The social cost of carbon comes from the use in politics. So they use the social cost of carbon to estimate the optimal tax of carbon or optimal mitigation policy. So it's used for other things, okay, but always by policymakers. And the interesting part is that even if we take the scholars talking about social cost of carbon, this is a methodology that has not been, didn't find consensus. So it's used, but there are also many economists saying, well, this is not really accurate as a methodology to quantify the cost of change. So this is the scholarship in general. There are also Okay, they propose new methodologies also, which is the abatement cost, but I'm not going to delve into this. So now, just want to make sure we talk about the impacts of climate change, the cost of climate change, methodologies proposed by economists to quantify climate change. Now we go back to the law. Already the European Court of Auditors in a report of 2021 shows that many environmental costs are not fully borne by polluters, and especially greenhouse gas emissions, the costs related to them are not internalized by polluters. So let's go into the case law and see how judges are behaving. Are judges following the methodologies proposed by economists, yes or no? I decided to take all the cases that are available on the database of the Sabine Center for Climate Change Law. And I try to search cases where there is a claim for compensation of damages. I use different keywords, but mainly I selected only the cases for the monetary compensation. And these are all the claims, like the heads of damages that I could find in the database. One side the US, on the other side the non-US. Now, you can read, but actually there are not so many cases where parties are asking a monetary compensation for climate change. This is the first thing. There are a lot of cases in the Sabine Center, but really few of them relate to a compensation, to a monetary compensation. And the most striking, interesting part is that in the US, the most frequent claim is about climate change adaptation and mitigation. So parties go to court asking compensation for climate change adaptation costs. So the cost for planning, infrastructure changes. So how can we adapt to climate change? Then we have property losses, productivity losses. The least claimed head of damage is actually the one related to the damage to natural resources. Now this is just basically these are the red boxes refer to the losses which I couldn't find in the US database. So no claims of this kind. Now we're moving to the non-US database. This is even more interesting. Only 20 cases I could find about the monetary compensation claim. And the monetary compensation exactly, so compensation is in general used in 20 cases. Monetary compensation has been claimed only 3 times or in 3 countries: Brazil, Indonesia, and France. And I want to show you this is a very interesting part. So in France, we have l'affaire du siècle, which we all heard about from 2018. The parties asked compensation for climate change, but they didn't, they quantified it with €1 as a symbolic amount of money. And there is no methodology proposed by judges. In Brazil, climate damages has been also claimed, and there is no methodology suggested in the law how we should compensate climate change, but the judges came out with what? The social cost of carbon as a methodology to quantify the impact. And they used $5 per ton of CO2. Indonesia was even more interesting. This is a country where I could find claims for compensation of climate change. And interestingly, the parties are using the law to say that there is already a methodology in Indonesian laws on how to compensate climate damages. And this law is also based on the social cost of carbon. So this is my conclusion. If we go back to the question, do polluters pay for the full cost of climate change in climate liability cases based on the economics of climate change and all the cases that we saw? Well, for now, what I could find is that in the US, mainly claims are based on adaptation and economic losses. So all the non-economic losses and costs from climate change are out of the climate change liability case law in the US. In non-US cases, we have a little bit more claims on climate damages or for compensation of climate damages. And the methodology used so far, which I could find, is the social cost of carbon. So the question, the question remains about the accuracy of this methodology. Is it accurate to use the social cost of carbon, considering the division in the economic scholarship on the use of this methodology? And so it's questionable if it's okay to use the social cost of carbon. Maybe alternative methodologies could be used. And still, in any case, I couldn't find in any case the calculation of adaptation and mitigation costs, which according to the economists are crucial to have an accurate amount of costs or monetary compensation in the end. So a lot of mismatch between what the judges are doing, what the economists are doing, and of course a lot of update needed for this research because things are. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the organizers first. It's been wonderful so far, at least, and yeah, you've been extremely welcoming. When I first saw Camille yesterday, I almost felt like I was meeting a friend because I received so many.
That's fair, that's fair.
You made it extremely smooth, so thank you so much. I would actually build on the presentation we've heard this morning about the Caribbean, because I will also echo the reparatory justice calls from the Caribbean myself. It is a work in progress. It's more a puzzle that I have right now. It's not a draft of a paper. I will present kind of my questions more than my answers. So I will focus on the Bridge Initiative and whether we can conceive it as a structural climate reparation. And of course, I will explain a bit more what I mean by that. But first, so you have my starting point. I consider that reparations in any shape or form must deal with two crises at the same time because those two are intertwined. And those are debt crisis in the global south and the climate crisis. And they are interacting with each other. In fact, it's a vicious circle because when a country is more vulnerable to climate change, it means in very concrete financial terms that on capital markets, this country will pay more to borrow money simply because the investors will consider that the investment is more risky. This greatly hinders the capacity of those countries to invest in climate resilient infrastructure, in climate adaptation more generally, which means that when hit by a climate disaster, the impacts will be greater and the economic recovery will be slower, which in turn increase the debt burden and so forth and so on. And so we need to think those two crises together. This is my starting point. And for that, I believe we need to move beyond the discussion, beyond the cash transfer focus that has so far been at the center of climate reparation discussion. Especially in climate negotiation, we focus on how much money, what will be the composition of this money, but also who should be the recipients. Those are extremely important questions, don't get me wrong. But this fails to address the root causes of the persistent debt crisis in the global south, which in fact very much constrain their adaptation capacity and also facilitate massive wealth transfer from the south to the north. So as we are discussing the little money that the north will give to the south, at the same time, there's a lot of money going to the south to the north to the payments of debt. And so there has been so far very little discussion about what some authors have labeled the international financial subordination of some countries and the structural asymmetries in their financing conditions. This is why I think we should move toward the structural approach to reparation. I'm actually building on other authors' work. Olufemi Taiwo speaks of a constructive view of reparation that should be forward-looking and redistributive. Some others have called them systemic reparation, insisting that we need to transform global economic structures that sustain climate inequalities rather than simply dealing with the symptoms. And this is actually not a new claim. I think this has very strong roots in the Black radical tradition. Here I quote Robin Kelly, who's an author in that tradition, and he's basically saying that reparations are part of a broad strategy to radically transform society redistributing wealth, creating a democratic and caring public culture, and exposing the ways capitalism and slavery produced massive inequality. So it's an ambitious program. And so I'm looking at what's coming out of the Caribbean, because it has such a strong tradition of thinking of reparation and thinking of reparation in a systemic and a forward-looking way. So this is a very short timeline, but already in the Durban Conference, the UN World Conference Against Racism, there was a strong call for reparation made by the Caribbean countries. In fact, they were against the West as well as against some African countries, which themselves aligned with the West in setting aside the reparation discourses that seems a bit divisive. But the Caribbean stands strong on that issue. In fact, later on, there was this influential book that was already mentioned this morning by Sir Larry Beckles, Britain's Black Debt, that makes the call for reparation for the native genocide and slavery, which then led to the creation of the Reparation Commission by the CARICOM, which eventually came with a 10-point plan for reparatory justice a year later. So I won't go into the detail of this plan because it was already presented this morning, which is great. It saves me time. Time is precious. I know you guys are. Stay with me, stick with me. What's interesting in this plan is that you see those forward-looking structural proposals with indigenous people development program, education programs, and also, most importantly to my topic, debt cancellation and monetary compensation. And so for me, there are three main features in the reparatory justice calls from the Caribbean. And here you have a picture of Hilary Beckles at the UN General Assembly. There's a Pan-African horizon with the idea of building transnational alliances between African descents in the Americas, in the US, in Africa, of course, in the Caribbean. It is built on the core periphery dynamic that is at the center of this discourse. The idea is that the economic marginalization of some countries is tied to the ongoing colonial patterns of resource and wealth extraction on a global scale. And therefore, and this comes logically out of it, it's the forward-looking and systemic perspective. Reparatory justice is not just a one-time cash transfer for the wrongs of the past. It's an alternative paradigm for a new and more inclusive development. And so with all that theoretical framework, I've been analyzing and looking at the Bridged Initiative. The Bridged Initiative has been proposed by the Barbados and Prime Minister Mia Mottley. Again, it's coming from the Caribbean, and it was proposed at the COP27 in Egypt in 2022, with the idea being that we need to reform the global financial system if we want to be serious about climate finance and reparations. There are a few proposals. One of them is to establish a global climate mitigation trust at the IMF, and the IMF would borrow money on more favorable terms, and then will distribute this money for climate investment in the South. So the idea would be to have money that would come at a cheaper price than what is actually currently available for those countries, and then it will be allocated. Then, and this has already been discussed by Yago, but the idea is to include systematically in all sovereign debt contracts a natural disaster clause that would enable to postpone the payments during a certain amount of time while the country is recovering economically. And finally, there needs to be a reshape of the way we assess debt sustainability. How much of debt is sustainable needs to take into account the climate crisis, and the proposal is to distinguish climate investments from other investments so that we don't prevent countries who want to invest in climate change because they would have an unsustainable level of debt. And what I find extremely interesting in this agenda, it's much more complex than those three proposals that I've presented now. It's just so you have a glimpse of it, is that there's some sort of a conflicting impulse. It's both the idea of decolonizing the international financial sphere, to have a new Bretton Woods, that's the term that is being used to represent better the interest of developing nations. And it has that structural orientation. It does not discuss cash transfers only. The point is to change the rules of the game. And at the same time, it's very much within the current financial architecture. The idea is to work with the World Bank, it's to work with the donors of the West, it's to work with the IMF. And it uses the same language than the IMF and the World Bank, which is we need to mobilize private capital in the West to fund the climate transition in the South. So this core periphery dynamic remains somehow. And this is a major shift. The Western wealth accumulation is no longer considered as the main reason of the South underdevelopment. It's a potential solution. It's an untapped source of climate funding. So the question then becomes, should we perceive the Bridge Initiative as the abandonment of the reparation politics that has been so far so central in the Caribbean, or is this a continuation of those politics? I don't know, but so there is the abandonment hypothesis. Just for example, because the core periphery dynamic is no longer questioned, the point is, of course, to secure the engagement of Western countries, which would be much more reluctant to accept the plan if this core periphery dynamic was at the center of it. In fact, Miyamoto organized in Paris with Emmanuel Macron a big conference for a global new financial pact, which means that it managed somehow to make the Western countries to buy into this new agenda. So this could be perceived as just the abandonment of the reparation politics. And Avinash Persaud, which is one of the main designers of the Bridge Initiative, is in fact the climate negotiator for the Barbados at the different COPs. He believes that reparation are just unnecessarily divisive and that we just should not talk about this. We should not frame what we're doing as reparation. But I think it's also, it could be perceived as a continuation of reparation. Simply because the ambiguity that I located in the Bridge Initiative can actually be located in any type of reparation politics in general, because reparation politics is always working within the constraints of the global financial order and global capitalism and its power balances, simply because it needs to secure the engagement of the countries in power in order to secure some reparation. So it can always have a very radical perspective, and at the same time, it always has to navigate the constraints. So in that sense, the ambivalence that I locate in the Bridge Initiative is a revealer, a reflection of the broader ambivalences of reparation justice in general. So to me, the question is not to say, well, this is not radical enough, and therefore we should give up on it. I think any type of politics, of reparation politics coming from the Global South will always have to water down its demands in order to negotiate. The question is, can it be perceived as a non-reformist reform? By that, I mean, as a way to shift somehow the power balance at least a little bit so that then we can build upon it for further victories that may be more radical. Or we perceive the Bridge Initiative as simply something that would reinforce and entrench the current structural dynamics of the World Bank, of the IMF, and more generally of the global capitalist orthodoxy. So those are the questions that I'm grappling with, and I think they are central to the reparation justice politics, simply because we can dream of very radical proposals, but at the end of the day, we also need to deal with the more realistic perspective on the political sphere of the global stage. And this is exactly what the Bridge Initiative is doing, and I think this is why it's so interesting to study it. So that was what I wanted to share with you.
So much, Matthias, and as a reward for being here on time, you get many questions, I hope, from the audience. I hope you have questions for me, because otherwise we're going to ask Francesca a calculation of historical damages. So. No, yeah, thank you so much. It was a very interesting and inspiring presentation. I have to monitor the chat as well. I want to check if we have questions from the audience, but otherwise feel free to, yeah. No, Yuki, if you want to.
Thank you. I really liked your problem setting, and I think this is very important question that you tried for. And I have a very simple question. If you're not ready to answer, that's totally fine. But what's your plan, or what's your approach to try to answer this question in there?
Yeah, thanks. So as I said, I just basically summarized all the questions that keep me awake at night. But my approach would be to conduct interviews with the main actors of the Bridge Initiative. And not only that, also with potential actors that have been pushing for reparation politics in the Caribbean, whether at the high level of politics, like Sir Hilary Beckles, if you have his number, I'd be more their name to have it, or on the ground, and how they perceive the Bridge Initiative. So this is the plan. I think this is because otherwise I will just remain stuck in this kind of constant struggle with myself, and I won't go far enough. Also, I'm trying to be aware of my positionality. I don't know enough about the Caribbean. I've never been there, in fact, and so I think it's much more powerful if I'm trying to make the voices of those who are behind those calls and those public policy proposals to speak. And if I can make them speak for the paper, that'd be great, and that'll be much more interesting, in fact.
Thank you both. Before I take your question, Yuri, I want to thank Anna, I think, who answered Fernand's questions on the chat. So maybe Anna, you can go back to that at the end if you want. Maria Antonia, if you're around, maybe I can give you the floor in like 2 minutes to provide us with your update on the Sabine Center database. Thank you so much. I don't know if you have the setup to speak, but anyway, we'll maybe take your question or comment after we've done with Matthias here. Sorry, so Yuri, you have a question for Matthias?
No, very brief for Matthias. Thank you, Matthias, for your presentation. I was just thinking that in the context of the Forum of People of African Descent, the Caribbean countries and many other countries have been pushing for the establishment of a tribunal to adjudicate cases of for historical injustice as a result of enslavement. So I was thinking, like, in your analysis or consideration, what do you think? What is the role of this? Like, does it give you some insights into what is going on? Because it's kind of a dual strategy, you know, diplomatic, but also the judicial strategy to try to get the most out of these complex negotiations. So that's the role of the law on this through tribunals, maybe establishing a tribunal that has jurisdiction to adjudicate historical injustices against people.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as we've discussed during those 2 days, we can't really separate the law part and the politics part, and they are always intertwined. And setting up a tribunal could be a way to reinforce some political demands, just they will be reformulated.
All right. Since I am the last speaker of the day, I would appreciate it if we can all stand up for a moment and do some stretching, because I'm severely jet lagged and everyone's a bit tired. So stretch to the left and stretch to the right.
Do we have a picture of that for?
The donors would be.
Anyone printed this?
So a big thank you, of course, to the organizers for bringing me here and for enabling us to speak on what I think, having heard this amazing panel, is quite a very small aspect of the big picture, but still one that we should talk about. And I have we are co-authoring this paper together with Adriana Martinez Blanco from Ruta de Clima based in Costa Rica and Jose Daniel Rodriguez Orue from World Youth for Climate Justice. And in this paper, we basically examine the emergence of US climate super funds, which are essentially a domestic push for strict liability frameworks to address climate harms caused by corporations. The goal of our inquiry is mainly to interrogate to what extent such mechanisms can either perpetuate climate justice or whether they can be considered a precedent or an innovation for advancing accountability for climate, for reparative justice for those most affected. So specifically in the way we've structured the article is we look at to what extent these climate super funds impact the demands by the Global South for reparative justice, to what extent they influence also what is going on in the courts in terms of climate litigation, and of course, to what extent they influence what is happening under the sea. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through all the background because we heard so much on this in the last few days. So I'm not going to talk about how we're overshooting 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees, how climate finance is falling severely short, how vulnerable communities continue to face the brunt of climate impacts and are least responsible for it. And I mentioned already climate litigation, so I'm skipping all of that. So enter the US climate super funds. These are essentially domestic approaches at the level of US federal states to recoup the costs for climate adaptation, forest damage, and in some cases also mitigation. They emerged in response to increasing climate disasters in several US federal states, and also to resist conservative efforts to roll back more ambitious climate policies and funding associated with that. They are modeled after the 1980 US Federal Act circular, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, which was initially conceived to impose strict retroactive liability for toxic chemical and hazardous waste pollution. The critical element of circular is that it imposes strict liability, but it is also retroactive, holding parties responsible for past pollution, even if at the time their polluting activities were not unlawful. The climate superfunds are at various stages. They were passed in Vermont and in New York. In Massachusetts and Oregon, the bills died, one as recently as 2 days ago, and we still have bills pending in 9 federal states at the moment. As I mentioned, they employ a strict liability approach, so they only target the largest fossil fuel producers and refiners, and they set a minimum threshold of them being responsible for at least 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions during a set period. And that covered period varies a lot. So it's sometimes as early as 1995. For other funds, it's 2000. Some go until 2018, 2020, 2024, or until the bill comes into effect. So they're shifting. I should also mention that these funds are not purely retroactive. For example, the California bill has a damage calculation that extends up to 2045. The way they work is companies that would fall under these funds would have to pay a proportional share of total damages based on their share of emissions. Some of the bills specify a very concrete cost recovery target. So for example, in New York and Massachusetts, it's set at $75 billion US. Others a bit lower, 9 billion, and some leave that to be determined through future studies or by the treasurer. What is also interesting is that the funding uses vary a lot. So sometimes you have infrastructure projects, increasing resilience. Others also mention renewable energy investment, zero emission transportation infrastructure, but the majority really is more on adaptation and loss and damage type of costs. What I found interesting from a justice perspective is even though they're geared towards US federal states, even then they still have a minimum requirement of 35% to 40% of the funding to go to disadvantaged communities within those federal states. Extraterritoriality doesn't seem to be an issue because the responsible party that would fall under these funds is determined through a nexus requirement. So they would need to have a sufficient connection with the state to satisfy this requirement. This is also linked in the US Constitution. They would need a physical presence. They need or have representatives in the states where their gross sale of taxable items would be above $100,000 or more than 200 transactions. And I think most major oil companies would satisfy that. I don't see how like national oil companies like Saudi Aramco or Indian Oil would figure in this, but at least the major multinationals would fall under this. I should also mention that there have been some unsuccessful initiatives to have a federal climate super fund. The most recent was in September 2024. It was called the Polluters Pay Climate Fund Act, and it aimed to generate 100 billion annually over a period of 10 years. And that bill, unfortunately, died in Congress. And that brings me to this point. So there's a lot of opposition from industry to these new initiatives. New York State was recently sued by 22 other federal states and also some private sector representatives. They're basically calling this a federal overreach. They see that anything related to climate emissions is regulated under the Clean Air Act, and it is not a matter that federal states should be taking into their own hands. Similarly, Vermont is also being sued right now by the US Chamber of Commerce and a trade group from oil and gas companies. as I was preparing this talk, I also saw that Trump just released an executive order 3 days ago, directing the Attorney General to intervene to stop climate laws and lawsuits with direct fossil fuel companies. So I thought I should mention that as well. And in that order, I think Vermont and New York are also expressly mentioned. So there's been a lot of lobbying going on. Now, building on this analysis of the funds and what they look like and how much they cover, etc., we sort of argue that there is a moral hazard in that they could inspire further other industrialized countries to develop such mechanisms. And in doing so, they would be shielding their societies and economies from the mounting costs for climate change, for loss and damage, and adaptation. And by doing that, they would essentially prioritize their own populations that have benefited from emissions-intensive extractivism over climate victims located in the global south, who are generally least responsible and least able to shoulder the costs of the climate crisis. So we analyze this from an equity and justice perspective, looking from a distributive lens. We discuss the polluter pays principle, of course, but also the beneficiary pays principle in this context. And I'm still discussing this with my co-authors, but we may bring in a decolonial perspective, depending a bit also on the case studies that we're going to look at. We find that there's a hypocrisy in that certain countries in the negotiations were pushing for an exclusion of liability and compensation, but then when it comes to sort of domestic mechanisms, that's exactly what they're pursuing. So perhaps this is also an argument that could strengthen the negotiating position of certain countries in the climate negotiations when faced with that. And we intend to sort of go back a little bit into the history around the first proposals by the Alliance of Small Island States for a liability mechanism and sort of see how that then contrasts with a sort of these national mechanisms. This second chunk of the paper focuses on to what extent this model is then replicable in global south countries. And my colleagues have canvassed around 16 jurisdictions where they looked at different climate framework laws that have also a funding component to see to what extent strict liability features in them. The answer is it doesn't. There's currently one in Costa Rica, a sort of draft legislation that establishes a climate protection fund, and it does have a strict liability element. We're still in the moment of fleshing, in the process of fleshing this out, but this may either become a case study or we will do a bigger comparative study if we find more evidence of other countries doing this as well. Yeah, then we reflect also on, of course, what this means for climate litigation efforts. And I almost invite the whole panel to contribute to this in the previous one, because I don't have all the answers, of course. But we see that it may boost arguments towards emerging transnational climate litigation, in the sense that if you have a strong acknowledgement that fossil fuel companies have knowingly caused the climate crisis and therefore should bear the consequences under such a strict liability standard, this may, of course, help with the narrative in front of various courts. At the same time, my colleagues have been arguing that having these strict liability mechanisms that don't really seek to have a lot of proof in terms of causation and attribution, this may also help lower the evidentiary burden in climate litigation cases. We also consider the risk of investor-state dispute settlement claims, looking at the Chevron saga, because of course there they place additional burdens on states that seek to recover costs from fossil fuel companies. So we wonder to what extent that may create a chilling effect on future initiatives, such as the Climate Super Fund in other states as well. From, again, an equity perspective, of course, we strongly argue that wealthy and industrialized states should lead in ensuring access to justice to non-nationals, so that this is not just a regrouping for US populations. And at the same time, that forthcoming advisory opinions on climate change may provide additional guidance on how to implement strict liability regimes in general. In reflecting on what is going on with the UNFCCC, with the development of the Loss and Damage Fund, we find that the existence and spread of these US climate super funds, but perhaps also in other global north countries, could further undermine the legitimacy of the UNFCCC as the primary forum to address loss and damage. And this builds to some extent also on many other points in my doctoral thesis that have also contributed to suggesting that there's a decline in the legitimacy of this process. We also find that if wealthy and high-emitting states prioritize domestic cost recovery through litigation or through national funds, this may further isolate developing countries in the process, who may then be relying on very shaky ground when it comes to climate finance that is, as we all know, very much underfunded. Whether all of this is going to lead to a shift in the discourse under the UNFCCC, I think remains to be seen. I don't see a shift happening from solidarity-based finance suddenly to reparations just because different countries are adopting liability mechanisms. That being said, my colleagues have argued with me on this, and they said, no, look, the fund for responding to loss and damage is still so somewhat undefined and broad that sources, that strict liability mechanisms could also be a source of funding that goes into the fund. In conclusion, we argue that the super funds and any sort of domestic strict liability mechanisms in principle could be a just mechanism for climate reparations, but only if extended beyond national borders to benefit those most affected and least responsible for the climate crisis. And perhaps I have a final word. Even if we may not know conclusively where the money will come from to pay for climate reparations, at least we have some idea of who should not be the first to receive it.
So all good things come to an end, right? And we've come to the end of these two-day workshop. So it's been wonderful listening to your presentations, to the discussions that have ensued, learning from you. We have certainly learned a great deal. I've learned that there's a new coin term, lost and found. Lost and found. I certainly hope that whatever has been lost can be found in terms of climate change. We've also learned that Camille is not only very nice and responsible, but also a strict timekeeper. So that is a good lesson for us. But joke apart, it's been very inspiring and enlightening. The project started about a year ago with Vladislav, Maria Antonia, and Armando, who are joining us online. And we had this idea of what is reparative justice? What is reparations for climate change? And as we started researching, we saw that we had more questions than answers. And the vision for the conference was born then. And then we decided to call for papers, and we had a very difficult decision because we got almost 150 abstracts. And the decision was, do we make it something small, just in person, or do we make it large, inclusive, and very diverse? And we've decided to, include, even though there were many excellent papers that we couldn't include, but perspectives from all over the world, and also allow participation both in Montreal, but also online. So now is the time that I express gratitude. So first of all, to the Social Science and Research Council of Canada, and our partner, the GNHRE. So this project started about a year ago with the support of the SHRC, as we call it here in Canada, and also in partnership with the GNHRE. So the four of us hired, Camille and Aeneas, who have been with us doing research, reflecting, discussing for a little over a year. And I also wanted to express gratitude to all of you that have come here, that have joined us online, that have shared your research and knowledge with us. It's been really wonderful learning from you, and it has certainly made me think a lot about these questions that keep me awake at night. So thank you so much. Thank you to the participants who have stayed with us no matter what time of the day or night online and here in Montreal as well. I have to thank our funding, which without which we couldn't have the workshop. So first of all, the SHIRC engagement partnership grant, and more recently, the Law Commission of Canada, who allowed us to bring this very interesting group of scholars, practitioners, activists together. I also wanted to thank the Centre de Recherche en Droit Public of the law school here, who helped us with the logistics, with the preparation, with the organization of the conference. And in particular, as I mentioned in the first day, Sylvain, who is the coordinator of the center, Rodrigue, who makes it seem very easy to keep everyone connected in all different continents, but it's a very hard task. Olivier, who has helped us throughout the 2 days as well. And also the people from the law school who had made it possible, who have given us this beautiful room. Even though we didn't have nice weather for the 2 days, at least we have a lot of light and windows. So thank you all, colleagues, for that. I also wanted to thank our fellows. So Camille, you all know, and Eneas, who you know as well, but also Geneviève, who joined us to make the report for the conference. So thank you so much. It wouldn't have been possible without your efforts and work. But last but not least, team members. So basically Vlad, who is almost like a brother to me. We've known each other for so long. We've collaborated on various projects. And Maria Antonia and Armando, who are joining us online. It's been nothing short of a pleasure working with you. I've learned so much. I always do. So thank you for co-organizing this conference, for being there, for discussing all the different papers and ideas. So I think I'll give the floor now to Vlad to talk about the summary of the conference, but also next steps as we move forward and hope to meet again sometime soon.
But the thanks are not over, because she couldn't thank herself, and we should all thank Miriam for hosting us here at the University. Without Miriam, we wouldn't have had this great venue, and we wouldn't have gotten the perks of actually talking to each other, communicating, and also making this an enjoyable experience in Montreal. And so I hope many of you will have had at least time to have a walk or maybe stay an extra day before leaving to your respective countries. And Miriam, yeah, we have a very long bond, but Miriam also has a very strong intellectual lineage, which is that of a late friend of ours, Judge Antonio Augusto Trindade, Cancelo Trindade, whom you might have read, a prolific scholar and prolific judge, was always, the times that I remember from the ICJ, was always in the dissent, but in the dissent for something which he considered more important than just good and ordinary relations between states, which was the well-being of an individual. In many ways, as Miriam does, as I think all of us on this project share, this idea that many other amazing scholars have expressed over a century ago, like Hersch Lauterbach in his famous 1933, the function of law in international community. But ultimately, it is the well-being of an individual which is at the core of any legal system, whether it's national, local, domestic, international. Of course, that concept is difficult to grapple with generally, because we are, whether we like it or not, in a system of states, and we have to operate with a very good dose of realism. So when we speak about creative solutions, we have to be realist above all. And as many things happen in international law, they happen incrementally. But guess what? There is a problem here. Because the problem we are facing is not incremental. The problem we are facing is of a volume and scale which doesn't allow us just to think, oh, slowly we can take forward some solutions here and there. We do have to think outside many of the boxes in which we have been placed over time. And there's even more fundamental issue with this proposition is that climate change, there's the paradox where we as an individual, we are both the cause and the victim. The question is, can we be the source of the solution? We are the cause, whether it's states, whether it's corporations, whether it's us as individuals. We are the cause of climate change. We are obviously also a victim, and we discussed, we can't just conceptualize our victimhood maybe in a traditional way as a person who was not able to publish an article or was not able to say something. We have to conceptualize it in a much different, much more cross-cutting way. And I think part of the reason we wanted to bring in this conference is to discuss the ways in which different disciplines approach the notion of reparative dimension, the notion of remedy, the notion of redress to situations where you lose your entire livelihood because you have to be replaced, relocated, because your state will disappear eventually in 15 or 20 years. So you have to think outside all types of boxes in which we have been placed in public international law. And I think that's where we wanted absolutely to bring all of you from different corners of the world, both academics, practitioners, civil society members, but also from different disciplines. And I think that's where, for me, at least as an organizer, this went really, really well, because we were able to learn and engage with each other in a relatively comprehensible way where we can speak to each other and understand sometimes complex concepts, but how we can channel them for good, driven from disciplines well beyond the law. And I think that's where the greatest added value, at least for me, came from these discussions. What clearly came out as well is we have a lot of tensions happening. We have tensions happening in terms of the layers of international, national, local. We have tensions happening in terms of state, corporations, institutions, individuals, communities. Climate change is reviving or even fostering some of the structural and historical injustices. And so when we are thinking through these new mechanisms like loss and damage, like different types of funds, we cannot ignore some of these underpinned, structural injustices which we might have to deal with. So all of this has come and we can understand that these tensions are not necessarily all of them can be resolved. And what is fascinating is over the last 10 years or so, we have placed a lot of trust in courts and tribunals. Well, let me be a bit of a spoiler alert. I think we can't just go that road. It's not the only route which will get us somewhere. I think we have overly high expectations of what courts can deliver, in particular international courts. And we have to really kind of condense and mitigate those expectations. And we have to work on many other fronts to achieve, fully the notion of remedy, reparation in respect of climate change. That being said, I do believe that we have a lot in the existing law out there, both of general scope of application, whether it is a law of state responsibility, whether it is specific branches of law, so different substantive norms, which we could explore and exploit further, both through the normal processes of evolutionary interpretation to at least try to navigate better through the processes that are ahead of us for the coming years. So I think we have to kind of, if there is a punchline out of what I'm preaching to you as a choir, is that I think this sort of dose of realism and idealism, we have to be very conscious of it. We have to be conscious that we have to think of solutions which may go beyond just the usual debates, but we also have to fully exploit what already exists, rather than necessarily jumping into creating millions of different things and sort of spreading out our wings rather than focusing and channeling our energy. I think there is some benefit in exploring some of these dimensions. We've seen how human rights law has sort of sticking points and helping points, but also where it may come to limits in terms of bringing climate change squarely within the human rights law debate as well. So we have to be conscious of those limitations, but we have to continue working in the direction. So in particular, I think the final point is to reflect deeper on what is really the sense and purpose and ultimate function of reparation. obviously we've heard and understood that all these different loss and damage funds and ideas, they are more kind of akin to things like technical assistance, financial assistance. In many ways, they are kind of more of a prospective, way of mitigating things going forward. But we do need to think more comprehensively about, is that all that a victim, whether an individual or a community, which completely will lose their livelihood, will need to actually continue living and enjoying the life on this planet? Because ultimately, and I want to leave you with this idea, nothing original, quite a lot that has been written on this, and I think you'll be releasing a really nice article on this, the idea of international law structurally, where sovereigns become the trustees of humanity. Trustees of humanity in the sense of, here we have nature itself, we have the planet where we need to preserve. They are the victim as much as us individuals, right? So the idea is, how do we channel this reparative justice towards protecting some of these global common goods, not just for our generations, but for many generations to come. And I think with that structure of mind, with that mindset, we have to think more and more about different forms of reparations that might arise in the future. And obviously, courts here and there might say something about that, but primarily it will come thanks to domestic constituencies if they exercise sufficient pressure on the lawmakers. It will have to come from the grassroots. I don't think courts will fix our problems in this area, whether we like it or not, and we all love reading good reasoning and citing it over and again. But believe me, it's humans elaborating that reasoning in very complex circumstances. We lived through the ICJ, deliberations, but with many other, courts and tribunals, it is humans as the ones sitting here in the room, actually thinking how we're going to put together this reasoning, in fact, in the most condensed and laconic way possible. So what I mean is the detailed engagement will not come from them. It will have to come from the grassroots. And I think each of one of us here in this room, I think has and carries this responsibility of pushing also at the grassroots, but also occasionally pushing from courts and tribunals to sort of at least get more or less in the right direction. So with that, I just wanted to emphasize that this is not the end of the story. We've commissioned your drafts. I think it would be fair to say that many of them are already of very good quality. Some maybe you sort of were rushed a bit here and there. Some on the edges. So all this to say, we would love to have all of you continue participating in a potential publication. And with that in mind, we actually thought of two parallel avenues. So the idea would be within the next, and we will send you an email. So I will spare you with details at 3:56. We will send you an email. It will be self-explanatory. What are these two avenues? But essentially, one of them is a very quick REST solution. You just prepare 1,500 words snapshot summary of your argument for purposes of a blog, which would come in a symposium on one of the well-read blogs in international law. And so the symposium would be around essentially what we've been discussing here. That would be a very snappy and short contribution. And in parallel, if you're so inclined, if you have time, you will have a couple of months to complete a full-fledged paper of yours, up to around 10,000 words, for an edited volume. And we already have a potential publisher for that. So, and the idea would be we would give you a few months to complete that work, which then you will provide us your drafts and we'll be able to comment. And then we will select a sample to send with our book proposal to formalize a contract, and then give you a couple of extra months to finalize the work based on our comments and suggestions. I hope that is all clear.
We'll send you a form. We love forms.
Exactly.
So the form will just to see if you are available, interested in contributing, so we can plan accordingly. So you will hear from Camille again. I know many of you will not be able to continue your life without a next email from Camille.
He's nice by email.
And the message will be in the sort of form so that we can kind of, in the organizing committee, see how many people are interested, available, if you would like to contribute to one or both. And then we'll go through the usual peer review process. I don't know if Armando, I know he's still online, if he wants to add anything, or Maria Antonia, if she's online. So just before we close, if you have any words, and if not, I think it's quite late for Armando.
Yes, and I'm sorry for keeping my camera switched off. I was walking around to get wireless, but precisely now that you give me the floor, my connection is unstable. But just to thank you, Miriam and Vlad and Camille and Anais, for being the local hosts. For those who just come and see things happening, everything seems so smooth and well organized, and it is well organized. But I can assure you that they did an amazing job behind the scenes for making this happening. And I'm sorry for not being able to be in person. I made half the way, so Vlad, of all the persons in the world, why did you place me in Lisbon and not in the Azores? So I did half the way, but then I got ill, and that's why I'm unfortunately unable to be present there. But thank you for participating, and thank you for the local hosts for the great job that you did.
Armando. And thank you, Maria Antonia, who has also been with us throughout. And it's been a great pleasure with all of you, having all of you here. And enjoy the rest of the day in Montreal, and safe travels back home. We'll be in touch by email and continue the good work for the good cause.
Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Thank you.